There's a particular hush at the jet bridge that only people who fly a lot recognize. It's not quiet exactly. There's the thrum of the auxiliary power unit, the rattle of roller bags, the wet squeak of sneakers on industrial carpet. But underneath all of that is a held breath. On July 19, 1989, that hush felt like a longer inhale than usual. I was holding a paper boarding pass that read United 232, Denver, Chicago, seat 21A. The date looked ordinary in blocky dot matrix ink, the kind of thing you might stuff in a pocket and forget. You don't frame a boarding pass. You don't imagine it will frame you. 21 rows in on a DC-10 puts you a little forward of the wing. From my window, the afternoon light caught the silver curve of the engine nacelles, like someone had buffed them with a jewelry cloth. People always think airplanes feel cold and anonymous. To me, they've always felt sort of alive. Soft vinyl armrests warmed by the last passenger, cabin air that smells like a mix of coffee and ozone. Alive and benign. That day, I took that feeling for granted. I slid my bag under the seat and did that little dance with my knees as my seatmates filed in. The man on the aisle was a salesman type. Tie loosened, eyes already scanning a stack of trade magazines. Between us sat a woman my mum's age, with a floral blouse and a square, leather-bound Bible. We did the stranger's exchange of nods. I offered to lift her purse to the overhead. She refused with a polite smile that said she liked to keep important things close. The flight attendants moved like choreography down the aisle, tapping overheads shut, glancing at buckles, reading faces the way good crews do. You can tell when a crew is seasoned. Their jokes land softly, their urgency is hidden in the seams. One of them, tall auburn hair pulled into a precise twist, paused long enough to notice that my tray table wasn't snapping flush. A thumb here, a practice shove there, and it clicked into place. "Gotcha," she said. 2 words that felt like a promise. Up front, the captain came on with a voice that could have sold insurance or narrated a baseball game. "Good afternoon, folks. Welcome aboard United Flight 232 to Chicago O'Hare. Looks like a smooth ride today. We'll be cruising at 37,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly." I remember liking his tone. The easy command in it, the invisible assurance that systems were checking systems and that anything with a bolt or a line or a circuit had been looked at, logged and blessed. Pushback. The arc of sunlight across the cabin shifted as we turned. The engine spooled with that bass note you feel in your ribs before you hear it. A giant inhalation turning into forward motion. For a second, or 10, I wasn't a person with a job and an apartment and rent due next week. I was a kid again, counting the beats between thumps in the runway to guess our speed. You can't help it when you love airplanes. You measure the world in vibrations and angles. We lifted. Denver fell away in a quilt of tan and green. The mile-high sun flattened the city into a model, and the Rockies in the rear window wore blue like a distant bruise. Flaps coming up, gear snugging into the belly, the little shiver through the fuselage that feels like an animal settling in. The aisleman closed his magazines and slept with his mouth open. The woman with the Bible smoothed a corner of a page and began to read under her breath like a private song. I did what everyone does once the seatbelt sign goes off. My own tiny inventory. Watch set to Central Time. Wallet still in pocket, a quick stretch. A peek at the safety card, the cartoon with the slide and the people who look unbothered by the worst day of their lives. I always looked. Not because I was nervous, but because the drawings felt like part of the ritual. You check what you hope you'll never need. You nod at the exits like you're learning names at a party. Somewhere over Nebraska, a flight attendant handed me a cup with ice and an entire can of ginger ale. "It's a long hour and a half," she said, a wink at the tyranny of small thirsts. I remember the exact shape of the can against my palm. I remember thinking how perfect the cabin air felt. Just cool enough, just dry enough, and that I should write more postcards like my dad did when he traveled. Weather fair, flight on time, wish you were here. People like to ask later if there was a sign. a bad feeling, a noise, an omen I ignored. That's the generous superstition of survivors and the people who love them. If only we read the world more carefully, it would warn us before it breaks. But that afternoon gave me nothing. We were a routine airline cabin, full of strangers being gently conveyed across the Midwest. A plastic wingtip flashing sunlight, a baby 2 rows back blowing spit bubbles, a flight attendant stifling a yawn behind her fist. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that thousands of pounds of thrust sat inches from pieces of metal older than my first car, that the life expectancy of alloys and discs and bearings is measured in cycles and inspections and what engineers call tolerances, as if life were an equation that always balances if you show your work. I didn't know that human hands had greased and gauged and tightened in good faith for years, and that something wholly invisible had been busy in the dark. A crack, like a whispered secret, growing. We talk about technology as if it fails the way light switches fail, on or off. But machines are stories told in stress and heat and time. Long before the cabin lights flicker, the story has already turned. Long before a pilot says, "Ladies and gentlemen," a microscopic truth is rounding a corner, becoming visible, deciding your future without you. A cart rattled by, coffee smell, ice clatter. Cookies or pretzels? I took cookies because pretzels felt too earnest for a Wednesday. I ate one and saved the second for later, a tiny act of optimism. 2 seats over, the salesman snored, and for a moment I envied him the luxury of sleeping through the fine print of existence. I looked out at a sky so clear it felt made to be crossed. The thing about ordinary is how it disappears the second it's gone. If I could edit the day, I might give you drama here. A shudder, a warning light flaring red, a face going slack with recognition. But no, Chapter 1 deserves honesty. We were fine. We were boring. We were 37,000 feet over the heartland, with the promise of Chicago waiting at the end of a moving map. If there was a soundtrack, it was the soft, endless hush of air over aluminum. And then, only then, much later, would the world teach me a new sound. The sound that splits a life in 2. It didn't sound like movies make it sound. Not a cute sputter. Not even the long, cinematic groan of a machine dying bravely. It was a bang, a hard, metallic body blow that I felt in my molars before I registered it with my ears. My cup jumped. The salesman's magazine slid off his lap. Somewhere behind us, a baby's cry clipped into silence, as if the noise had reached in and pinched the sound right out of the cabin. Then came the shudder. Not turbulence, no soft, bumpy handshake with a cloud. This was a deep, bone-level vibration that turned the floor into a drumhead. It built, stuttered, settled for half a heartbeat, and started again with a different rhythm, like the airplane was coughing and couldn't clear its throat. The cabin lights didn't flicker. The masks didn't drop. Everything looked normal, which made it worse. When the world looks fine and feels wrong, your brain has nowhere to put the feeling. The seatbelt sign chimed on, once, twice, and in that insect-bright ding, I heard something I'd never heard on a plane before. Hurry! A flight attendant was already in the aisle, one hand braced on a headrest, the other pressing the interphone to her cheek. Her eyes did one quick sweep down our row and caught mine long enough to be both honest and kind. "Stay put, I see you." The cart, a few rows ahead, had been mid-serve. Now 2 crew members were wrestling it into the galley with their hips, the wheels squealing in protest. The airplane yawed left, then right, then left again. If you've never felt yaw before, imagine a boat whose rudder has suddenly become a suggestion rather than a rule. The horizon in my window tilted, corrected, overshot, corrected again. Someone said too loudly, "Is that normal?" The woman with the floral blouse closed her Bible and held it like a bird. The captain came on. Calm voice, close to the mic, the way you talk to a skittish horse. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a mechanical problem and we're working it. We have the aircraft under control. Please return to your seats and make sure your seatbelts are fastened." He paused. You could hear the breath between his words. We'll be landing as soon as possible. I didn't know then what words were being exchanged up front or how many hands were on how many throttles. I didn't know the phrase loss of hydraulics or that an airplane could become a body without nerves, muscles severed from brain. All I knew was the dance, the tail wagging slow then quick, the wings seesawing between too much and too little. The salesman woke with a smack of lips and tried to make a joke that went nowhere. My seatmate whispered a prayer that didn't ask for anything specific, which felt right to me. We didn't know what to ask for yet. We started turning, a big, lazy circle that wasn't lazy at all. Out the window, the green of the Midwest unrolled in a perfect quilt. Corn, soy, roads cutting across flatland like an engineer's pencil. The cloud shadows kept their pace, indifferent. I held onto the armrests, palms sweating into plastic that had been touched by a million other strangers. If fear has a taste, it tastes like the penny you used to put on your tongue as a kid. Metallic, coin flat. The intercom dinged again. The flight attendants' voices came in sets, coordinated and low. Ladies and gentlemen, may we have your attention for a moment? Nobody said the word emergency. Not yet. Training has its own liturgy. They knelt in the aisles to talk level with kids, with elderly couples, with the guy who kept unbuckling to reach his bag, because that's what people do when they can't control anything. They go looking for their stuff. Sir, I need you seated, right now. Firm, not mean. Ma'am, I promise I'll help you with that in a minute. A hand on a shoulder, a smile that was all teeth and duty. We banked again, stronger this time. The angle pulled the airplane into a body I could feel against my own, the way a dog leans into your knee to steady itself. Over the right wing, the engine nacelle looked as serene as a sculpture. I remember thinking, if something's wrong, it's hiding well. The rational part of my brain tried to inventory noises, to compare them to every other takeoff, every other flight. The other part was busy bargaining with nothing in particular. I'll call my sister more. I'll stop rushing through goodbyes. I'll be less casual with the living. When the captain came back, his voice carried a new ingredient, decision. Folks, we're diverting. We're going to land in Sioux City. We'll be on the ground soon. A silence pooled after the words. Sioux City meant geography became real. It meant we were now tethered to a dot on a map none of us thought we'd ever see from the inside. Later, much later, I would learn words like uncontained failure. I would see a diagram of a fan disk, learn how a tiny crack can grow invisible in metal, the way a grievance grows in a family, quietly over years, until the day it speaks with violence. I would hear about redundant hydraulics and the way all three lines ran through the same place so that when the wrong part let go, shrapnel had a straight shot at every backup built to keep us safe. Redundancy is a human prayer. Sometimes physics answers in its own language, but in that cabin, knowledge was a future luxury. We had only our senses and the choreography of the crew to read. They moved faster now. The tall attendant with auburn hair crouched by our row. Hi, we're going to be landing soon, she said, not overselling the word landing. I'm going to explain a position you'll use on my command. It'll help protect you. It'll feel strange. You're going to do it anyway. She demonstrated the brace. Feet flat, seatbelt low and tight, hands on the seat back ahead, head down. If you can't reach the seat in front, cross your wrists on the back of your head and fold over them. The woman beside me tried the posture, then winced. My shoulder, she said. The attendant adjusted her hands, gentler than a physical therapist. Like this. Better, then to me. Window shade up for landing, please. We want all eyes. I did as I was told. The world outside brightened by an inch, which is how narrow obedience can feel. The announcements kept coming, small and practical, seatbacks upright, tray tables latched, carry-ons stowed fully under the seat. The safety card I'd smirked at earlier came out again, and this time the drawings weren't cartoons. They were instructions from someone who had thought about this longer than I had ever wanted to. The aisle became a workshop. Belts were tightened, necklaces were tucked. Parents rehearsed with children in stage whispers, "Head down, honey. No, like this." We dropped. Not a plummet, but a steady descent that made my stomach float in a way I associated with roller coasters and bad ideas. The right, left, right yaw didn't quit. If anything, it tried on new tempos, like the airplane was searching for a gait it could keep. My hands learned the armrest so well, I could find the screw heads with my fingertips. The cabin had the charged quiet of a church just before the procession starts. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, "flight attendants, prepare the cabin." It wasn't panic. It was an order wrapped in mercy. You could feel the crew fold into it. Tight smiles gone, faces now all function. The auburn-haired attendant's voice took on a clean edge. "Shoes on, glasses off, put them in the seat pocket, loose items secured. When I say brace, you brace. We will practice. Together." We practiced. Strangers put their foreheads against fabric that had held 1,000 other heads. Someone sobbed once, short, like a cough. The baby was awake again, hiccuping soft, resilient hiccups. I thought about my father teaching me to change a tire, about the way he'd said, "Machines don't love you, but they'll respond to care." I wondered how much care it took to get 30 tons of airplane from broken to earth without asking the wings to be angels. I imagined the cockpit, the checklists, the wet math of fuel and distance, engines and airspeed. I imagined hands on throttles coaxing a wounded animal through a corral it was never meant to walk. The ground grew detail, fence lines, a ribbon of highway, the silver of a water tower. Somewhere far forward, a kid asked, "Are we going to crash?" And a stranger's voice, somebody else's mother, said, "We're going to land, and we're going to do it together." It was the best answer anyone had. The last thing the auburn-haired attendant said before she took her jump seat was, "Look at me." We did. "I know you're scared, I am too. Do it scared." She squeezed the seat back with a quick, private fierceness, then vanished behind the bulkhead. The engines changed pitch, a twin roar like ocean surf pulling back before it hits. The runway, long, grey, impossibly thin, lined itself up with my window. I put my feet flat. I crossed my wrists. I lowered my head into the dark pocket of my arms and breathed in the cotton and someone else's cologne. When the command came, it came like a bell. "Brace!" The world narrowed to the sound of my own breath and the feel of the seat biting into my shins. And in that small, cramped universe, I made a promise to the person I hoped I would still be on the other side of the next minute. If we live, I will not look away from how we lived. Fear has a tempo. At first, it was a drum I could keep up with. Heartbeats, the click of buckles, the intercom chime. Then the rhythm changed. The airplane began a strange up-down lurch layered over the left-right wag, a seesaw that made your teeth touch in little, involuntary taps. Later I'd learned the word porpoising, but in the moment it just felt like we were skimming along the edge of a decision the airplane couldn't make by itself. The auburn-haired flight attendant returned, a new stillness in her shoulders. "We'll be landing soon," she said again, as if saying it twice could sand the word's edges. She checked our belts with quick, practiced tugs, then pointed at my shoes. "Tie them tight." To the woman beside me, "Glasses off, in the seat pocket." To the aisle, "Everything secured. If it can move, it will." The salesman tried for humor, something about getting frequent fear miles, and she met it with a look that was kind without yielding. "Sir, feet flat, please." We practiced the brace position again. She walked us through it like she'd taught 100 classes. "Feet back under your knees so you don't submarine. Seatbelt low and tight. Hands here, head down, on my command." When she moved on, the woman beside me let out a breath she'd been storing. "I don't think I can hold it that long," she whispered. "You won't have to," I said, lying kindly. The captain came back with that same steady vocal metronome. "Folks, we'll be landing on runway at Sioux City. You'll hear the crew give instructions. Please follow them immediately." He didn't waste a word. The absence of details was its own kind of detail. We were far past commentary. We were in the country of verbs. Outside my window, the Midwest had stopped being a painting and started being a place. Fields turned into rectangles with texture. Houses sprouted into neighborhoods. The horizon tilted, corrected, tilted again. Somewhere forward, a child kept asking now, in a small voice, and a man 2 rows behind us answered every time, almost. It felt like a promise we were learning to say to each other by taking turns. The cabin crew split their attention like magicians. One attendant crouched by a mother with a baby, demonstrating how to hold the child's head low against her chest. Another coached an elderly couple through the movement without making them feel frail. A third stood near the overwing exit, feet planted wide, eyes scanning for trouble before it had a chance to become an emergency inside the emergency. "If we evacuate," she said softly to the man on that row, "you pull when I tell you." "Not before." He nodded too much. She touched his arm just once, anchoring him to the timing that would matter later. I looked down the length of the cabin and realized how much had already changed. No one was a stranger anymore. People lent each other words, names, jobs, small facts that would fit on a tag, and those words made a web. The salesman told me he was called Eric. The woman with the Bible said Margaret, and offered her hand, then left it there, palm up, an invitation. I put mine in it like an oath you don't say out loud. We began a wide, descending turn. The airplane's body language said work, a deep muscular labor you could feel through the seat rails. The engine's pitch shifted minutely and often, like someone up front was playing them with the care of a string instrument, searching for pitch control where there was none to spare. I didn't know names, but I knew effort when I felt it. Somewhere beyond the locked door, people were working at the edge of what hands can do. "Cabin crew, be seated!" The PA crackled the instruction that means last chance. Our auburn-haired attendant took one more pass, quick as a heartbeat, then leaned into us. "I'll call it. When I say brace, you stay down until I tell you to get up. No one stands until you hear me. Promise." We promised. She squeezed the seat back in front of me with 2 fingers, a gesture of focus, then backed into her jump seat and clicked in. Her face in profile looked like a statue of courage someone had carved by memory. We dropped through a layer of air that felt lumpier, like a staircase whose rises were uneven. The yaw worsened into a light roll, then back, then forward again. Over the left wing I could see the flaperons, tiny trim movements, not the big gestures I was used to. The sky had the washed-out color of late afternoon. Far off, a pencil line of gray marked the runway. Closer in the infield, emergency vehicles lined up like a child's careful parade, red, white, and chrome glints too bright to be anything but prepared. Someone behind me started to cry hard, air hitching in like a hiccup. A stranger's hand found theirs. The human body knows when it has reached the edge of its own comfort. It goes looking for other bodies. I thought of my sister, of a dumb fight about a borrowed jacket, and a sudden panic fluttered at the thought that I had let something small sit between us like a stone. I promised the air I would call her. I promised the air a lot of things. The crew's voices changed to the landing cadence, a chant that is half drill and half lullaby. "Heads down, stay down," they practiced with us, building the muscle memory we'd need when memory itself went white. "Brace, brace, brace." We did it on count, then reset, cheeks flushed, belts double-checked, lives reduced to a few correct positions. The strange democratic intimacy of it, a cabin full of people agreeing to be synchronized at the exact second that might end us. I took one last look out the window. The runway was bigger now, textured with rubber scuffs, crowned slightly. The approach felt too fast and too shallow to my untrained eye, but I kept that observation to myself. The airplane shimmied, corrected, shimmied, like skating on rutted ice. My world condensed to the radius of my arms, the fabric of the seat back ahead, the scuffed plastic of the tray latch under my knuckles, Margaret's breath catching and smoothing, catching and smoothing. "Brace, brace, stay down!" The shout rang down the cabin, picked up by each attendant as a chain, front to back to front, until it sounded like a single voice with many mouths. I folded. The top of my head found the cushion where my palms had made a warm print. Feet back, belt tight, jaw unclenched so my teeth wouldn't shatter. The rhythm of my breath became the clock I trusted. The last seconds before contact are a border you cross without a stamp. Time compresses into a stack of senses. The burn of recirculated air, the sharp tang of adrenaline rising like electricity in a storm, the grit in the carpet I could feel through the soles of my shoes, the exact place in my shoulder that was going to object to this posture tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow. The noise changed first. The engines poured on power, then eased, then poured again. Throttle work I could map in my chest. The wheels searched for ground they weren't guaranteed to meet in the right order. The airplane found a fraction more left than it wanted. I felt the tilt in my kidneys. The chant came again. "Brace! Stay down!" And I understood that the command wasn't just about posture. It was a refusal to look away at the worst possible second. We touched. Not the crisp bite of rubber and runway that tells you the end of a flight has begun, but a heavy, crooked arrival that rolled through the frame like dropping a crate. The left side hit harder, a scream of metal on concrete, then a lurch that pulled the seatbelt tight across my hips. For a quarter second, the floor felt like it wasn't parallel to anything on Earth. The sounds multiplied, thunder, tearing, glass trying and failing to be strong, each one a ragged edge with its own texture. I kept my head down. I counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. We were no longer flying. What came next would break the day in half. Impact is not one sound. It's a choir. First there was the slam, a sideways punch that shoved my ribs into the armrest and my forehead deeper into my crossed wrists. Then came a screeching rip, like someone trying to tear a skyscraper in half with their hands. Underneath those, a grinding gravel roar that I realized was the runway becoming teeth. We weren't rolling straight. Even with my eyes down, I could feel the airplane tip, the right side dropping, the whole frame twisting around a point my body couldn't name. My seatbelt did its violent kindness, biting hard, keeping me where it wanted me. The overheads exploded open one after another in a clattering volley, a storm of plastic doors and orphaned objects that had belonged to calmer people. The smell arrived in layers, burned rubber, hot dust, a bready whiff of torn insulation, and underneath everything the sick, sweet tang of jet fuel. "Stay down! Stay down!" The chant rode over the howling metal. I obeyed because obedience was smaller than panic and fit in my hands. Margaret's breath in the seat beside me turned choppy, animal fast. I kept my forehead pressed to the fabric and fixed my eyes on nothing, a grey weave gone dark with sweat, because looking felt like betrayal. If I looked, I would make it real. Then the world broke. Something huge separated behind us with a crack that had shape to it, a giant's knuckle snapping. The floor tilted further. Luggage tumbled forward like a second. Meaner gravity had been switched on. The lights went out, or my eyes did. It got dark either way. We spun, a sudden, brutal quarter turn that yanked my neck sideways, then slid in a new direction. Noise reassembled into distinct attacks, a thump, thump, thump of gear or engines hitting and letting go, the staccato shatter of windows surrendering one at a time. A hiss that I only understood later was atomized fuel turning to breath-stealing mist. The heat found us next, an invisible wall pressing its palm against the left side of my face. The cabin had been climate-controlled polite 30 seconds earlier. Now, it was a place without weather, only physics. The chant came again, "Stay down," and a new word braided through it. Fire. That word did something to the body that reason couldn't. It sent my muscles into a deeper crouch, as if flesh could become smaller than flame. We decelerated in ragged chunks, speed tearing itself away from us piece by reluctant piece. Somewhere forward, metal shrieked and then went quiet, the terrifying mercy of something large finishing what it was going to do. My teeth clicked together hard, stars went off behind my eyelids. Then, in the obscene silence after catastrophe, I heard an ordinary sound. Cornstalks whipping past the skin of the fuselage, a soft green hiss like rain. The airplane stopped. No, not stopped. Ended. The motion ceased. The noise didn't. Fire crackled with an appetite that had nothing to do with us. A living thing delighted with its meal. Someone groaned in a voice so low I felt it in my own chest. Another voice, sharp, trained, cut through. "Release seat belts, leave everything, come this way." I lifted my head. The cabin was a torn tunnel. Ceiling panels hung in a snarl. A row ahead, daylight punched through a wound in the fuselage so bright it felt like a lie. Smoke moved in horizontal sheets, a low fog that stung the soft places, eyes, throat, the skin under your chin you forget you have. My window was a rectangle to a world on fire. On the right, past the aisle and beyond a collapsed overhead, orange climbed the wall like a fast ivy. On the left, field, open, impossible, the green of a world that had not noticed we were trying to die in it. Margaret. My voice came out as someone else's rasp. I turned. She was bent over, frozen in a brace that had outlived its moment, eyes wide and wet. "Seatbelt," I said, reaching. Her hands fumbled at the latch like it was a riddle. Mine found the square metal tongue, pressed, and the belt sprang loose with the heartbreakingly casual click of any other day. "We're going," I told her, not asking. I shoved my feet back under me and felt the floor give in a way floors don't. The salesman, Eric, was slumped at a bad angle, blood printing one temple. He blinked slow, like waking from a nap he didn't want. "Eric," his name anchored him. "Unbuckle." He did, hands shaking out of time. The aisle was no longer an aisle. It was a corridor of obstacles. Seats skewed sideways, the carpet humped into ridges, a ceiling bin hanging by a stubborn hinge like a jaw. The auburn-haired flight attendant was there, impossibly calm in the stink and the shouting. Soot had traced her cheekbones like war paint. "Left side, this way." She pointed past us at the torn seam where daylight poured in. "Hands and knees if you can, the air's better low." To a man who was trying to pull his suitcase free, she said, without raising her voice, "Drop it, you don't need it where we're going." We moved. Hands and knees, head low, lungs learning the new rule. Small breaths, quick. Every crawl forward meant deciding what pain you could ignore and what obstacle you couldn't. A shoe, someone else's, slid under my palm and disappeared. The floor was littered with the soft wreckage of everyday life. Pages torn from a paperback, a stuffed bear with one eye, plastic cups melted into modern art. My fingertips found the raised circle of a rivet through the carpet, and I used it like a rosary bead. One more inch, one more. Behind me, Eric grunted, a trapped sound. I glanced back. His jacket sleeve had caught on a twisted armrest, a thread of polyester turned leash. I leaned back, teeth in my lower lip, and yanked. The fabric gave with a sound like a small, mean laugh. "Move," I said, and he moved. The air tasted like a penny in a campfire. The opening at the left side was a mouth into bright. 2 rows ahead, a woman was trying to stand in it, wavering near the torn edge as if a breeze could push her back inside. "Sit and scoot," the flight attendant shouted, and the command jolted her into the muscle memory of childhood slides. She dropped, slid down the skinned metal, and vanished into green. We reached the hole. I looked out. A cornfield pressed right up to the fuselage, stalks broken into spears. Beyond them, a cleared strip of earth where the fuselage had ploughed a furrow, foam already whitening the dirt in eruptions as trucks hosed the wreck with life. "Go!" the attendant said to me, palm up to help. Though we both knew she wouldn't waste a hand hauling me out, I had to make the movement mine. I sat on the edge, felt the sharp tooth of torn aluminum find my thigh through denim, and pushed off. For an instant, I was a kid on a diving board, and the world was only air and the idea of landing. Then the ground was under me, not hard, just there, uneven and honest. Hands reached. Strangers wearing yellow gear or regular clothes turned suddenly useful and pulled. Someone said, "Run!" in the universal voice of now, not later. I turned back. "Margaret!" She was in the mouth, eyes watering, hair wild. "Feet first!" I called, miming the motion, because words were getting more expensive by the second. She sat, scooted, gasped as the sharp edge bit, and slid. I caught under her arms in a grip. My shoulders would loathe me for tomorrow. We staggered together into weeds that made a noise like secrets. A heat whoomph rolled out of the wreckage and slapped the field flat around us. The sound was less dramatic than movies would have you believe, and more final. Fire blooms with a confidence that doesn't ask for permission. Behind us, the fuselage section we'd left changed shape in the language of combustion. The auburn-haired attendant appeared at the hole again, waving others through, counting with a pointed finger, sending them left, away. "Over here." A man in a helmet, firefighter or guard, I didn't care, spun his arm in big obvious circles that cut through the smoke. "Keep moving! Keep moving!" Direction felt like salvation. We moved. The field sucked at our shoes. Fuel and water made mud into a treacherous skin. Sirens doppled in layers. A radio squawked close by with clipped words that sounded like orders and names of trucks, runway numbers, things that meant someone had a plan. We stopped when a line of people told us to stop. They were building a corridor, human stakes in the ground, keeping the newly unbroken from wandering back toward fire, from the animal instinct to circle what hurt you. Someone pressed wet towels into our hands and said, "Cover your mouth." Someone else said, "Can you walk?" and looked at our legs like appraisers. A third person, astonishingly gentle, took Margaret's hand like the hand of a child and said, "You did so good. Sit here." She sat on the corner of a foam-covered tarp that had been a piece of truck a minute ago and was now a bench. I turned to look back because gratitude makes you look. The wreck had split into sections. A middle tube smoking like a burnt loaf, a tail assembly at a wrong angle, a wing made into a bonfire. In the distance, another piece lay tilted in a way that made the stomach go soft. People kept coming out. Each arrival felt like a coin the universe had flipped our way. The auburn-haired attendant came last from that left side gash, coughing, eyes streaming, her hair half out of its twist, a dark edge to her silhouette where heat had drawn a line. She didn't sit. She pivoted to the next group, voice already back in the register of jobs that needed doing. "Anybody missing someone?" a medic asked. The answer was yes, and all of us. A triage rhythm took hold. Green tags, yellow tags, red tags, colors that meant prioritize, stabilize, pray. The salesman, Eric, sat down hard on the ground, like gravity had doubled while no one was looking. Blood had dried in a new geography on his face. "You with me?" I said, and he nodded, which was enough to pass some test I didn't know I was giving. I tore my sleeve, pressed it to his temple, and felt practical, which felt like dignity. Shock is a clever thief. It steals noise first. Everything went muffled, and then steals time. I don't know how long we stood in that field, with the sky stabbing blue between columns of black. Minutes could have been quarters of an hour. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, even though heat kept hammering us from behind. And I understood that the blanket was a boundary as much as warmth. You are on this side of what happened. A name cut the air near us, shouted, then sobbed. A man staggered, then ran, then stopped, because a line of responders caught him with that soft, firm way people learn from training and from being human. "We'll find her," a voice said, with a certainty that may or may not have been true. A helicopter shouldered in overhead and hovered, beating the fire's smoke into new shapes. The world had become verbs and elements. Run, foam, triage, lift, breathe, burn, cool. I looked down at my hands. They were black to the wrist with soot, and something glittered on the knuckles. Shards of the window plastic maybe, or a little of the airplane I would never fly on again. The ring I wore, a cheap steel band, had a nick in it that I traced with my thumb like a map. Proof you can hold is a dangerous comfort. It tempts you into believing you understand. When I finally sat, the ground answered my bones honestly. Margaret leaned into me with the weight of somebody who had been holding herself up for too long. We didn't talk. The air between sentences was an animal learning to breathe again. A medic crouched and took my pulse, looked into my eyes with a flashlight whose beam felt like it had authority. "You're shocky," she said, not accusing. "Sip this. Small sips." Water found its way into my throat like a stranger moving through a crowded room, careful, apologetic. Behind her, the burning shifted notes, from furious to sullen, and the hiss of foam rained down. Engines idled, radios fussed. A man nearby recited a phone number aloud, over and over, like a spell. The sun kept being the sun, indifferent and bright. It pressed shadows under the helicopters, put a glare on the chrome trim of trucks, made a halo on the spray that arced and fell, arced and fell. There are moments you imagine all your life without knowing you're imagining them. I had pictured being brave in the abstract, a movie reel of future heroism I could play when I needed to feel good about myself. This wasn't that. This was not leaving when I wanted to run, and moving when I wanted to freeze, and holding a stranger's hand because hands were the only proof we had that our bodies still knew how to say yes to each other. "Name?" someone asked with a clipboard that looked obscene against the wreckage. I gave mine. "Seat?" I said 21A, and the number rang inside me like a bell that now meant two opposite things, where I had been almost erased, and where I had been preserved by a belt, a brace, a crew whose work was the thin line between chaos and a corridor into a field. Far across the grass, I saw a cluster of uniforms near what had been the cockpit. I didn't know those men yet, wouldn't know their names for days, but I knew the posture, the bowed backs of people who had given more than most of us will ever be asked to give. The thought arrived clean and indelible. Technology failed. People didn't. We waited for the next instruction. We waited for someone to tell us how to begin the strange math of after. At some point, the verb softened. The shouting thinned into instructions you could hold without dropping. Fire became smoke that became steam. Sirens resolved into vehicles at idle. People who had been running began to walk. The world around us steadied its hands enough to count. They called it triage, which I had only ever heard in television dialogue. In a field, it means color first, stories second, green if you can walk, yellow if you need help walking, red if you need help to keep the story going, black if the story has ended. A young medic with freckles and a jaw that tensed when she was thinking pinned a paper tag to my blanket and wrote something in quick, smudgy blue. She asked for my name, and I heard myself say it like I was borrowing it. "Any pain?" I said. "Everywhere, but not the kind you need to fix first." And she gave me a look that was both grateful and a little sad. "Good," she said. "Stay with her," nodding toward Margaret. We sat on the edge of organized chaos and watched order grow like scaffolding. A bus that usually ferried ground crews became a waiting room. The back of a pickup became a cabinet of bottled water, gauze, tape, those single-use foil blankets that make people look like baked potatoes, ridiculous, life-saving potatoes. Men in flight suits worked shoulder to shoulder, with women in jeans and t-shirts and reflective vests. I asked one of them, "Are you military?" And he said, "Today I'm whoever you need me to be," and ran a line of saline into a teenager who was shaking like a tuning fork. The auburn-haired flight attendant came by and knelt in front of us. I didn't realize how much taller she was until she was lower than my eyes. Soot made tear tracks on her face without the tears. "How are you?" she asked, and the question was so outrageously gentle I could have cried. "With you now." "Better," I said, and that was true in a way that didn't need a doctor. She squeezed Margaret's hand and then mine. "You did exactly what you needed to do." It felt like being pinned by a medal I didn't deserve. "Is everyone?" I couldn't finish the question. Her mouth did a small, honest thing. "Many are out. We're still working." She stood, winced once, her own body giving its report, and moved on to the next circle of faces. Someone started a roll call under a pop-up canopy, the kind you bring to farmers' markets and never imagine deploying in a war against physics. They got names from manifests, matched them against mouths. We formed a loose line, a bouquet of smoke-smelling people holding our identities like passports. Last name? Seat? Traveling with anyone? On a folding table, a clipboard, a radio, a stack of sticky notes that stuck badly in the damp air. When it was my turn, I said 21A, and the woman with the list nodded like that number explained me. "Do you have someone to call?" she asked. I did and I didn't. The person I always called first, my dad, would pick up like he had calibrated his whole day to be ready for it. But he also had a heart that did its own thinking. I pictured his face trying to be brave for me and felt the floor under this field tilt a little. "My sister," I said instead, giving a number that lived in my muscles more than my memory. A volunteer handed me a landline phone, the color of mustard, its cord snaking into a generator-powered tangle. I dialed. No service was a phrase for other people. Out here, there was service, period, because someone had driven service to the edge of a cornfield and plugged it in. It rang. Then my sister's voice, "Hello?" Like a cup of cold water poured somewhere behind my breastbone. "Hey," I said, not recognizing my own breath. "Don't panic, I'm okay. There was The word accident felt both too small and too greedy. We didn't make it to Chicago." She went quiet and then asked slowly, carefully, as if talking to a deer, "Where are you?" "Iowa," I said, and we both laughed once in that stupid, light-headed way you laugh when nothing is funny and your body insists on relieving pressure. I told her enough and not too much. I didn't say the words fire or people or counting. I said, "I'll call again when they move us," which turned out to be immediately. They moved us by ambulance if we were tagged red or yellow, by bus if we were green. Green meant you could walk. It did not mean okay. On the bus, the seats were vinyl and clean in a way that felt obscene given what we looked like. Everyone smelled like burnt, like adrenaline's chemical tang, like fear's stale penny. Eric slumped beside me, a pressure bandage now taped across his temple and a different kind of vacancy behind his eyes, as if part of him had stepped into a quiet room and closed the door gently. Margaret sat on my other side, hands clasped in a perfect prayer she might have forgotten she was making. Out the smudged window, Sioux Gateway rolled by in pieces I'd only ever seen from the right side of a cockpit door, a control tower that had just had the worst day of its life and would stay on frequency anyway. A line of engines and foam trucks resting on their haunches. People in uniforms, standing still in that particular stillness, shared by those who have recently moved faster than they thought they could. Then the bus swung onto a county road, and we saw front yards with flags. A boy on a bicycle who stopped and put a foot down and stared. A woman with a dish towel in her hand on a porch, mouthing, "Oh God." The hospital we pulled up to had a name that felt like a promise and a dare. Something like Mercy or Unity, and a front entrance that couldn't possibly have expected this number of people, with this number of needs. Yet it opened wide. The lobby became a triage bay. Volunteers with latex gloves moved, like they'd rehearsed disaster all their lives and hoped never to perform it. A nurse with silver hair and the voice of a kindergarten teacher ushered us to registration you didn't need insurance for. Name, allergies, blood thinners. "Okay, honey, sit right here. We'll get eyes on you." Eyes were everywhere, ophthalmology flushing smoke from corneas, orthopedics palpating ribs that made politely alarming noises, ER threading IVs like they were sewing people back together with clear thread. A chaplain walked the edge of the room like fog, finding the spots that needed an extra layer of air. A young doctor crouched in front of a man with a 1,000-yard stare and said, "Can I see your hands?" Not because he needed to, but because the man needed to be connected back to them. They catalogued us. They cut away clothes with trauma shears that made confetti out of denim and dignity. I lost my shoes and a shirt I liked and accepted the exchange with a gratitude that bordered on greed. A nurse cleaned my forearm where shrapnel, or plastic pretending to be, had done a series of unkind things. Each sting of antiseptic was proof of continued membership in the living. She said, "You're lucky." And I said yes, and we both understood how sloppy that word is and used it anyway. In a quiet corner temporarily designated for psych, a counselor with gentle, businesslike hands explained shock like it was weather we could dress for. "You might shake," she said. "You might feel nothing and then too much. Time will zigzag. If you find yourself laughing at strange moments, that's okay. If you can't stop crying in the grocery store next week, that's okay too. Eat something salty, drink water. Today your job is to stay in your body." I nodded like a student and then realized I had no idea how to do the homework. She pressed a packet into my palm, paper with numbers and lists of symptoms that read like someone had written down the inside of my skull. News tried to happen at the edges. Television screens flickered alive with faces who had learned the trick of speaking sympathy into a lens. The words breaking and live crawled under footage that was somehow both us and not us. The counselor gently pivoted one TV toward a wall. "You don't have to watch yourself from the outside just yet," she said, and the relief I felt at that was surprising and pure. I asked questions with no respectable answers. "Do we know how many?" Heads shook, eyes doing that waterline wobble, then steadying. Numbers drifted through the hospital like birds that hadn't decided where to land. One said hundreds, another said dozens, both words too blunt for the surgical specificity the heart demands. What I learned then, and have relearned since. Counting is its own emergency, and it unfolds at a pace reality can survive. At some point, a man with a notebook and a badge that said NTSB, letters I had never needed to arrange in that order, came by our little island of chairs. He asked if I'd be willing to talk later, gently, not fishing, not pushing, just laying a bridge into the future where facts would have to replace the storm surge of feeling. "Not today," I said. He nodded like he admired the boundary. "We'll be here, and we'll be thorough." I believed him, and hated that he had to exist. I fell asleep sitting up, forehead against a wall that had seen births and hips and stitches and would now be painted with our breath. I woke to a styrofoam cup of broth that tasted like hospitality made edible. Margaret was there every time I looked, which felt like proof that the world might still obey continuity. Eric had drifted to radiology and back, with a collection of images of his skull he would later frame as a reminder and a dare. By evening, a list went up near the intake desk, accounted for and in treatment, and a third list with a heading no one wanted to read. People approached the lists like parishioners, hands hovering, eyes scanning, bodies bracing for the sacrament of information. I walked past quickly, then circled back because not looking felt like negligence. My name was under accounted for. Beside it, a number I recognized, 21A. The fact of it hit me with an intimacy that embarrassed me. An aluminum body had come apart, and I was still sorted with the living. A volunteer with a stack of hotel vouchers found us. "The town's opened everything they've got," he said, an apology tucked into the grin. "We'll get you to beds. We'll get you clothes. You can come back for your belongings." Belongings sounded profane. I had my hands. I had Margaret's palm, warm as a sentence that keeps going. I had a ring with a new scar. The rest could introduce itself later. In the van to the hotel, someone said the pilot's name, and then another name and another, the crew becoming more than voices in ceilings. A murmur passed through that small bus like thank you repeated in a dozen dialects of exhaustion. I stared out at the Iowa night, which wore stars like ordinary, was still an option. The shock counselor's voice recited in my head, "You might feel nothing, then too much." The hotel smelled like carpets and coffee and an optimism that couldn't possibly have been meant for nights like this. The front desk clerk had the face of someone who had already cried at her locker and now was going to perform grace, because that's what the job demands when life stops asking nicely. She handed me a toothbrush and a T-shirt with the town's name on it, like a strange passport into a country that hadn't existed this morning. "We're glad you're here," she said, and it landed with the weight of a blessing. In the shower, the water ran black at first, then grey, then clear. I watched soot and unnameable flecks snake toward the drain and had the childish thought, don't let it take too much. In the mirror afterward, I looked like I had been erased with a careless eraser and then sketched back in by a hand that hadn't quite finished. I lay on a bed that was too soft and too clean and didn't feel like mine. And the moment I closed my eyes, I was back in the seat. The world tilted, the chant filling the plane's torn throat. Brace, brace, stay down. I sat up. The room held. I breathed on purpose, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6, a trick some first aid voice had taught us behind a curtain that smelled like bleach. On the nightstand, a card with a number for a hotline we now shared with each other, whether we wanted to or not. I picked up the phone and dialed my father after all. He answered in a voice I had known since before language. "Hey, kiddo," he said, because caller ID had saved him from the terror of not knowing who needed what. I told him the minimum amount of truth a daughter can deliver to a father and still be telling the truth. We talked about corn, as if that were the point. We built a small raft and floated on it for exactly 5 minutes. When I hung up, the room did not change shape. The night continued to be night. Before sleep finally bested vigilance, a single sentence settled in like a tenant. Technology failed. People didn't. I had watched systems tear, redundancies go silent, steel choose its own physics. I had also watched strangers become a temporary nation with laws and rituals and a shared anthem of help. The math of after is cruel, but it's also astonishingly generous. How many of us does it take to carry one of us through a minute? Answer: all of us, and then all of us again. Tomorrow, there would be numbers and diagrams and interviews in quiet rooms. Tomorrow, I might learn words like fan disk and hydraulic lines and understand how a tiny, hidden fracture can turn time into shrapnel. Tomorrow might ask me to look at photographs I would not want in my head and keep them anyway. But tonight, in a borrowed T-shirt in a town I had never planned to set foot in, the lesson was simpler. We stayed. We stayed with each other in a field and in a lobby and on a bus and in a room that smelled like coffee. And in the staying, we pulled the day a fraction back toward human. I turned off the lamp. The dark rose up the walls like water. Somewhere across town, a siren lifted and faded. Someone in the hallway laughed and then apologized for laughing. I put my hand over the spot on my thigh where the airplane had signed its name and said a prayer so small it didn't need words. We were alive. We would have to decide what to do with that. Morning didn't tiptoe. It barged into the hotel room with a square of Iowa sun and the smell of burnt coffee drifting under the door. My borrowed T-shirt had the town's name across the chest in block letters. I stared at it for a long time, the way you stare at a uniform you didn't audition for. My thigh had a tooth-mark bruise where the torn fuselage had taken a bite. My neck complained about the brace position, like a coach with notes. When I closed my eyes, muscle memory tried to climb back into row 21. I stood up before my mind could follow. Downstairs, the lobby had turned into a way station, folding tables, clipboards, coolers of water, a cardboard sign that said, "Family Assistance," in block letters too cheerful for the job. Volunteers moved like they were late to kindness. Someone pressed a granola bar into my hand with the solemnity of communion. Margaret found me by the coffee urn, and we did the awkward dance of two people who weren't sure if they were allowed to hug yet. We hugged anyway. It felt like claiming continuity. A man in a blazer with an airline logo appeared at our table, carrying soft-sided kits, toothbrush, razor, socks, a T-shirt. The small mercies of travel turned into triage. He introduced himself by first name only and said the sentence all corporate training manuals prepare you to say, and none prepare you to mean, "We are so sorry." He meant it. I could see the muscle jump in his jaw with every apology. "We'll help with calls, clothes, transportation," he said. "And we'll help you see the people you need to see." That last part hung in the air like a chapel bell. A whiteboard on an easel offered shuttles, hospital, civic center, counseling, personal effects, later, media room, optional. The word media made my stomach do a wet flip. I turned it into a verb and moved away from it. We chose hospital first. Not because we needed more medicine, we needed to match faces with names we had built little altars for overnight. On the bus, someone practiced a first and last name under their breath, like a spell they didn't want to miscast. Another survivor stared at their hands and said a seat number once, 10F, as if confessing a location could explain an outcome. Back at Mercy, the lobby had regained a little gravity. The foam and ash smell had thinned, traded for antiseptic, and the paper smell of fresh forms. A chaplain stood by a cart of tissues and quietly arranged them by color, as if order could be smuggled in through small doors. The triage tags had turned into wristbands. The bands made us official in a way that felt both safe and implicated. We visited rooms. Some people were sitting up, looking suspiciously like people in a hospital for boring reasons. Appendixes, sprains, except for the charcoal smudges at their hairlines and the way their eyes tracked doorways like animals scanning for weather. Others lay in a geometry of pillows that suggested ribs and clavicles had filed complaints. I learned that the language of "how are you" had to be redrafted on the fly. We tried out "I'm glad you're here" and "I'm so sorry" and "do you want water?" and kept the ones that fit. At midday, a man with a clipboard and a patient face found me in a hallway, NTSB on his badge, a pen behind his ear like a carpenter. "When you're ready," he said, "we'd like to record what you remember. Take your time." The phrase, "take your time," meant both today if you can, and we will live here for months if we have to. I followed him to a small room that smelled like new carpet and coffee. A cheap tape recorder sat between us like a pet you keep for company. I told the story from board to cornfield. He didn't interrupt except to anchor the timeline. Seat 21A, cabin left. The sound, before or after the yaw. Did the cart pass you once or twice? Could you see flame from your window? It felt like being debriefed by a calm version of myself. When emotion tried to get clever and fill the gaps with metaphor, he brought me back to angles and sequence, a kindness I didn't know to ask for. "You've helped a lot," he said at the end, and he meant it. I signed a page that turned my memory into evidence and left with my hands buzzing like a bell had been rung in them. In the family room, someone had wheeled in a TV, then turned it face down like a well-trained therapist had walked by. We didn't need the loop. Loops lived inside us. A map of Sioux Gateway Airport lay on a table, annotated in a rainbow of markers, runways, approach paths, the black X of the furrow we had dug. A firefighter in a soot-stained uniform stood over it with a paper cup of orange juice, explaining to a man in socks how their disaster plan had once been a drill with volunteers and plywood and a practice fuselage. "We were halfway set up when the real call came," he said, a sentence with both miracle and indictment inside it. In the afternoon, a rumor made the rounds and then became fact. The captain's name was Al Haynes. The crew had kept the airplane flyable with throttle work after all hydraulic lines went silent. An instructor pilot, Dennis Fitch, had come up from a passenger seat to put hands on the power levers and make an impossible machine answer to very human touch. I wrote the names down on the back of a pamphlet and underlined them. Technology had handed us a quiet catastrophe. People had improvised a language to talk to it anyway. The mechanics of what failed arrived in pieces, carried by nurses who used to be mechanics, by a reporter who knew an engineer, by a man who had flown a DC-10 long enough to use its slang. The words were shaped like a children's puzzle. Fan disc, titanium, fatigue crack, uncontained hydraulic lines, and when fitted together made a picture with the quality of a Magic Eye poster. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. A floor no one could see had been living in metal longer than some of us had been alive. When it spoke with shrapnel. The lines that were meant to save us, redundant hydraulics, ran together in the wrong place, and so physics wrote no on every system at once. You don't need a degree to understand the cruelty of that sentence. Evening moved in wearing fluorescent light. The civic center filled up in a way I'd only ever seen for graduations and blood drives. Now the sign on the door said briefing, and the rows of chairs looked like a secular church. Airline representatives, officials in windbreakers, a sheriff with a mustache that felt like home, a nurse from the 1970s who had never learned to be anything but capable. Each took turns at the mic and translated chaos into sentences. They told us what they knew and what they didn't. They said numbers without pinning them down like butterflies. More than 100 gone, many alive. Because counting is a moving target when a day this big has just ended. Then a captain from a different crew, pressed uniform, voice that carried, stepped up and did something that rewrote the room. He talked about checklists and muscle memory, about CRM, crew resource management, a phrase that sounds boring until it saves you. He talked about the way you learn to say out loud, "I don't have the airplane," and hand it to someone who does. He said that when the automation goes silent, you fall back on people, and that the cockpit yesterday became a little democracy that argued kindly and flew by committee. The applause was soft and long, and had grief braided through it. After, in a hallway that echoed with bad coffee and good intentions, I met a woman who had been in row 9 and a man from the jump seat at the back. We traded fragments like baseball cards. The cart jammed here. I saw blue out this side. The command came from the back, too. It didn't matter if our pieces matched perfectly. The act of building the puzzle together kept the wolves at the tree line. Survivorhood started to feel like a club. No one should have to join, and everyone inside wanted to make gentle. The airline set up a small room with clothes donated by people who had gone home, opened their closets, and returned with armfuls. I tried on a pair of jeans that fit like a compromise and a flannel that fit like permission. On a table, a basket of letters. From school children, from church groups, from people who had sat in our seats in some previous life. Filled up hour by hour. I read one that said in shaky pencil, "I'm glad you're not dead. Brevity has its own theology." That night we went back to the hotel with vouchers that didn't begin to name what the town had given us. The front desk clerk had dark crescents under her eyes and a stack of room keys fanned like tarot. I took a key and a flyer with a list of local councillors and a reminder about tomorrow's briefing. In the elevator, someone laughed at nothing and then cried at their own laugh and then apologized to the car. No one asked them to stop doing any of it. In the room, I turned the TV on for 2 seconds and saw the aerial shot, the striped scar across green, and the crawl of braking across the bottom that refused to stop braking. I turned it off. I sat on the carpet and laid out the pieces of the day like tools. A wristband, a folded map with a marker X, 2 names underlined twice, the ring with a new notch, a new word, porpoising. I could have gone my whole life without knowing. I texted my sister a photo of the wristband because proof helps you sleep. She replied with a picture of her cat asleep in a sunspot and 3 words, "Call me tomorrow." I set an alarm for a time morning would recognize. The room smelled like detergent and dryer sheets and the slow leak of fatigue. I crawled under a comforter that had wrapped other people's ordinary nights and let it wrap my extraordinary one without complaining. Before sleep took me by the collar, I said the day's prayer again, not out loud. Technology failed, people didn't. And then I added a line, because the day had earned it. The invisible had a name. Now we do too. By the second morning, the name Sioux City didn't sound like a dot on a map anymore. It felt like a person who had opened their front door in their bathrobe and said, "Come in, we'll figure it out." The hotel lobby had turned into a bulletin board of kindness, ride lists, meal times scribbled in Sharpie, a paper taped crookedly to the elevator that said, "Free laundry, leave bags with room 214. Someone in 214 had decided washing strangers' clothes was how they'd fight physics. At the Civic Center, the basketball court was a grid of folding tables and donated dignity. Piles of jeans sorted by size, shoes lined in obedient rows, racks of button-downs that smelled like other people's detergent and weekends. A woman with a church name tag and a drill sergeant's efficiency fitted me with a flannel and didn't apologize for tugging the sleeves to check range of motion. "You'll want freedom here," she said, tapping the shoulder. "Trust me." I did. We all did. Trust had become a communal currency, passed hand to hand. By noon, a line of casseroles arrived like a parade. Lasagnas that had seen better pans, tuna bakes with labels that read, "No onions." Allergies? Disposable foil trays of brownies with insultingly cheerful sprinkles. The Salvation Army parked a truck and poured coffee for anyone whose hands needed something warm to hold. The Red Cross set up cots in the back room for when adrenaline's lease ran out and we defaulted to collapse. People kept asking what we needed and then filling the space before we could answer. A teacher arrived with a stack of children's books and read in a corner to a cluster of wide-eyed kids who were learning too much about the world too fast. A pharmacist set up a folding table labeled Meds Refill and took down names and dosages like spells. A barber unrolled his kit and gave free haircuts as if grooming could shepherd us back across the line that divided before from after. In the late afternoon, they invited us to the firehouse. It felt like being called backstage. We sat on benches that smelled like oil and heat, and the first responders told pieces of their day with a humility that didn't let the room get away with clapping too soon. One firefighter described the moment the alarm came in while they were in the middle of a drill, how practice and reality collided so neatly it felt like a cruel joke. Another talked about standing in a line with a charged hose in his hands and making a human corridor that said this way to people whose brains were not taking suggestions from language. They didn't glorify anything. They talked foam, angles, wind, how the field's irrigation ditches and the July heat made the fire behave like it had opinions. A guard pilot in a flight suit explained how they'd held a helicopter just above stall to keep eyes on the perimeter without turning the downwash into a second disaster. A paramedic admitted he'd broken protocol to let someone hold his hand in the back of the rig because the line between medicine and mercy is thinner than textbooks admit. We thanked them with a noise that was part applause, part prayer. That evening, in a church basement, folding chairs faced a podium and a cross. The pastor began with a verse and then smartly stepped out of the way. The microphone morphed into a confessional. A woman thanked a man who had given her his seat on the ambulance because he was tagged green and she was not. A teenager stood up, shook like a leaf and said, "A lady told me where to put my feet," and the room laughed softly because we all knew who that lady was, even if we didn't know her name. A farmer in a John Deere cap spoke from the back. "I was first on my field that morning to check the corn. Didn't know I was first on a runway I never planted." The room, impossible as it sounds, found a way to hold that sentence without breaking. The crew's names traveled through the room like steady lights: Al Haynes, Dennis Fitch, William Records, Dudley Dvorak. The more we repeated them, the less abstract the cockpit became. They were no longer voices from a ceiling. They were men with families, bodies, and choices that had been measured in seconds and throttle. Someone said, "I heard they flew her with the engines." Someone else said, "That's not a thing airplanes are supposed to do." "No," a pilot in the second row answered, not unkindly. "It isn't." And yet. 2 days later, I met Haynes. The introduction was not cinematic. No halo, no soundtrack. Just a man in a short-sleeved shirt and a face that had discovered a new kind of tired. He accepted thanks with the awkwardness of a good carpenter being praised for saving a house in a storm with the only tools on hand: rope, nails, stubbornness. I said the sentence we were all using, worn smooth now. "Thank you for getting us here." He shook his head a little. "We got as many as we could," he said. The grammar mattered, we, not I, and I carried that plural away like a lesson I hadn't known I needed. The investigators were ghosts with notebooks. Polite, focused, always asking if now was a good time. In a quiet room with a pitcher of water that kept sweating miserably onto a paper coaster, I retold the minute where I unbuckled Margaret and we went toward the light in the side of the fuselage. "Left side hole over the wing?" the agent asked, pen ticking. "Forward of the wing," I corrected, surprising both of us with my certainty. I realized memory had started to calcify, hardening into the shapes that would make it into reports, and eventually into the single paragraph by which strangers would learn our day. I also learned about survivor's math, the arithmetic your brain does at 3 a.m. without permission. If I had been one row forward, if I had paused to grab my bag, if I had not, if I had. The numbers never balance. The only checkbook that closes is the one where you deposit acts, not hypotheticals. Squeeze a hand, take a statement, send a thank you, go to a service, write a letter. That math could at least show its work. A bus took us back out to the site on a day when the wind came from the right direction and the smoke had finished talking. The field had been transformed by hoses and heavy feet. Foam crusted the furrow like meringue. There were flags where pieces had been and were not anymore. Tags fluttering in the heat, a scavenger hunt no one should be good at. A woman from the county led us gently, voice at the correct, respectful volume of a museum docent. "Here," she said simply, near a freshly clear patch of earth, and the group went quiet in the way that feels like a room lowering itself to kneel. I had thought going back would make me feel brave. It didn't. It made me feel small and accurate. The corn whispered exactly what it had whispered the day we arrived uninvited. Wind in 1,000 paper tongues. I crouched and pressed my fingers into the dirt until the cool reached my nails. It was the only way I knew to say thank you to ground that had done its unglamorous job, stopped us. Media found us the way water finds a slope. Some were kind, some were crisp. Can you talk about the moment? How did it feel when, what do you want people to know about? I learned how to say no without apologizing, and yes when the question felt like it would build something useful. A local anchor asked what I thought failed. Metal, I said, because we'd been given those words now. Fan disk, fatigue, uncontained, and because naming the invisible felt like refusing to be haunted by it. "And?" she prompted. "And then people didn't," I said. She nodded, didn't smile, and let the silence stand. At night, the town staged its own defense against despair. A diner stayed open past midnight to feed anyone wearing a wristband or a uniform. The high school put on a free community concert where the band played a medley with a key change that made a few of us sit down and breathe a minute. A motel marquee read, "We love you," in letters that had once sold vacancy and cable TV. A kid at the gas station held the door for me with both hands, like politeness might be contagious if he used enough of it. The services began. Vigils first, then funerals. Churches in every flavor of architecture filled with names and photographs and flowers whose colors felt too loud for the rooms. We learned to sit in pews the way we had sat in rows, elbows not quite touching, breathing in sync without meaning to. Families stood one by one and translated "please come home" into eulogies that broke and mended and broke us again. A woman read a letter to a husband who had taught her the difference between a crescent and a socket wrench. A boy told a story about his mom's laugh that made the sanctuary laugh out loud, relief exploding like a valve opening. We carried tissues in each other. The airline moved us through logistics with the tenderness of people who had learned to treat paperwork like a life jacket. There were tickets home for those who were ready to step onto another airplane, and bus and rail for those whose bodies were not accepting the premise yet. A counselor said gently, "Don't make your first flight alone if you can help it." And I decided to treat that as gospel. Margaret and I looked at each other. "When we go," she said, "we go together. Contract signed without ink. On the last night before leaving, a potluck sprang up in the Civic Center parking lot, as if the town couldn't let us go without one more chance to feed us. A boy with braces asked me to sign his cast. He'd fallen off a skateboard 2 days before the accident and was newly delighted that strangers were treating him like a fellow survivor. A firefighter I recognized from the field sidled up, hands shoved into his back pockets in the universal posture of men who feel too many feelings for their vocabulary. "You all made it easier to do our jobs," he said. I told him the truth. "You made it possible to do ours. We didn't have a word for the we yet. Survivors, responders, nurses, pilots, pastors, clerks, kids with combustion-sized eyes. We were a temporary nation, improvised and fierce. When we scattered, we would carry passports stamped in a cornfield and show them quietly to people who could read them. Our anthem would be simple and stubborn: stay with each other." On the bus back to the hotel, the July sky did its long late sunset trick, painting the edges of clouds like it had hired a lighting designer. I caught myself counting breaths without panic for the first time since the brace command. Beside me, Margaret hummed something that might have been a hymn, or might have been whatever tune a heart makes when it's repairing itself. Eric snored softly, his head lolling to the rhythm of a bus that wasn't trying to be a plane. I looked out at the fields rolling by and felt the tiniest flecks in the place where terror had set up camp. Space. Not much. Enough to imagine a different chapter title than What Happened. Technology failed. People didn't. The sentence had been true the moment we hit the ground. Sioux City taught me the second half of the lesson. People kept not failing on purpose for days. And that, more than diagrams or fault trees, felt like the story I owed to anyone who would listen. Tomorrow, we would try the thing that seemed impossible: going home. Not to where we had been headed, but to where our lives would have to resume, different coordinates on the same map. The morning we were supposed to leave, Sioux City felt like a house the party hadn't quite ended in. Coffee brewing, doors opening and closing, people hugging in doorways, the floor a little sticky with too many feelings. The whiteboard in the lobby had sprouted a new column: flights, buses, trains. Under flights, someone had written, "Group travel available, counselor on board." Margaret and I looked at each other over paper cups of coffee that tasted like resolve. We had made a promise in a waiting room: when we go together. We nodded. Together then. At the Civic Center, airline reps handed out itineraries like truce flags. A pilot in uniform stood near the table, not posing, just available. He had the posture of someone who believed in checklists in the same way other people believe in prayer. "If you're flying today and want to talk through anything before we go, I'm here," he said. No sales pitch, just a doorway left open. We stepped through it. He led a little circle, 7 of us and the counselor from the hospital, into a side room that smelled like folding chairs and pledge drives. He laid the safety card on a table and did what no flight attendant had ever done for me before. He treated it like scripture. "This is what the doors do," he said, tapping the cartoon with an engineer's tenderness. "This is what we practice. Here's when you'll hear from us. Here's what silence means, and here's what noise means. Our airplane today has 4 hydraulic systems, dissimilar routing, different compartments. Even if one is hurt, the others keep talking. And if all else fails," he added with a quick human glance, "we have each other. We brief, we back each other up. We say it out loud when we don't have the airplane." He didn't say United 232. He didn't have to. The counselor coached our breathing, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6, and wrote the numbers on a sticky note like a permission slip. At the airport, Gateway looked smaller than the day we'd first seen it through cracked windows. Familiar is allowed to shrink. Out on the ramp, a narrow-body jet waited, sleek, almost prim, like a cousin of the DC-10 that had decided to major in restraint. The APU's steady whir slid under my skin and rattled a cupboard I hadn't opened yet. Margaret touched her wristband, like checking for a pulse. "Window or aisle?" she asked. "Aisle," I said, and realized I had asked for my first post-accident accommodation, a tiny win dressed as a seat assignment. Before boarding, the captain came to the gate. Not a speech, just context. "We know what you've been through. We've added a few extra words today. If you want detail, we'll give you detail. If you want quiet, we'll give you quiet. If at any time someone needs to step off, we'll pause. The runway will still be there." The gate area exhaled. I didn't recognize the feeling at first. Then I did. Consent. Down the jet bridge, the carpet had that stiff newness of a place that had just been vacuumed for company. At the door, a flight attendant with kind eyes took my boarding pass and my fear in one practiced motion. "Welcome aboard," she said, and then lowered her voice just a notch. "If anything feels loud or fast, catch my eye. We can name it together." She said, "Name it," and that cracked something loose in the best way. We sat in row 8, aisle and middle. Eric took the aisle across, a white butterfly of bandage at his temple like a punctuation mark. The cabin smelled like cold air and coffee. Nobody was bored. Boredom would have been a luxury. People buckled carefully, as if the belts had been upgraded to an oath. I slid the safety card out, not as talisman this time, but as equipment. I mapped the distances, 8 rows to the forward door, 4 to the overwing. I counted like I might count compressions in a CPR class I hadn't taken yet. The PA chimed. My shoulders flinched, and then remembered that flinching was allowed. "Good morning, folks." The captain's voice could have sold calm by the pound. "We'll taxi out and hold a couple of minutes to give our friends here time to settle. I'll keep you posted." A thing I had never noticed before, how the tone of a crew spreads like weather. This was a sky I could breathe in. Taxi was a slow walk across a familiar yard. The APU's hum became engine spool, a deepening note that skipped my ears and went straight to the base of my skull. I watched Margaret's fingers tap the beat of the breathing exercise on her thigh. I matched her count. The engines reached that moment, every takeoff has it, where the sound steps over a line from idle to intention. A flash of heat ran up my arms, and I had the primitive impulse to stand. The counselor, 2 rows back, aisle, caught my eye and held up her palm. A slow, grounding traffic cop for one. Lining up, the captain had promised detail, and he delivered it in tiny, digestible squares. "Winds light. A little cross on the right. We'll be airborne in about 30 seconds. The airplane turned. The runway arrowed ahead, grey and dry and blessedly ordinary. The engines rose again. My ribs tried to retreat from my spine. I kept my feet flat and my jaw unclenched and let the physics I used to trust touch me. Acceleration came like a strong friend taking your hand and saying, "Let's go." It rolled us back into the seats with that theater curtain sway I had loved since I was a kid. This time, love and fear braided together, the nose lifted, that perfect pivot where the world changes its angle but not its mind, and the ground started to leave us. The counselor's hand appeared between the seats for a beat, a human metronome, and withdrew. Wheels thumped into the wells. There's always a small shiver when the gear doors close. I had never realized how intimate that sound is until now. We climbed. I waited for the betrayal that didn't come. No bang, no yaw hunting like a dog on 2 leashes. Just the steady chorus of an airplane doing airplane things. Breath by breath, my body gave its report. Alive, alive, alive. The flight attendant knelt in the aisle, rule-bending kindness, in the brief gap before service and said, "Noise you'll hear in a minute, flaps finishing like a whir, then acceleration again, that's climb thrust. Later, a ding, that's just the belt sign." She narrated a soundtrack I had always heard and never listened to. Naming it turned volume into vocabulary. At cruise, the cabin discovered the fragile muscle of small talk. A man across the aisle said he owned a hardware store and that he had never noticed how many different kinds of screws hold an airplane together until he noticed them all at once. "I used to love titanium," he said, and tried to smile and failed. And then we both forgave him for failing. Eric scribbled in a pocket notebook with a hotel pen, like he had been assigned homework on living. Margaret closed her eyes, lips moving around a prayer or a recipe or both. The captain came back on with a voice that had time in it. "We're on course, air's smooth. We'll start down in about 20 minutes. If you prefer, I can talk you through the descent and landing the same way." A soft chorus of yes rolled up the aisle, more exhale than word. He didn't make a speech about courage. He gave us sequence and let the sequence stack up into something that felt like it might last. I used the bathroom mid-flight and caught my reflection in the mirror. Hotel t-shirt, wristband, eyes with new miles on them. The sink's metal edge flashed, and I flinched at the knife-bright memory of torn aluminum against my thigh. I put a palm flat on the counter until the present pushed the past politely to one side. On the way back, I steadied myself on seatbacks and realized how many hands had made my path possible. The upholsterer, the engineer, the cleaner who had snapped a tray table back into its latch last night in a hangar that smelled like rags and jet fuel. Machines are stories told in parts. People are the commas that keep the story from running on. Descent began with the soft throttle retreat and a nose that tipped only enough to be a courtesy. The captain kept his promise. "Here comes a small bump. Change in air. We're slowing a touch. You'll hear the engines answer." The dings came like doorbells. Belts clicked. The world out the window gathered edges. Fields, roads, the toy thoughts of buildings. My hands got sweaty in a way that felt unremarkable and monumental at the same time. Flaps 1, flaps 5. He didn't read the checklist over the PA, of course, but in my head I wrote it for them and for me, a new civilian liturgy that went, "We remember. We prepare. We land." The gear came down with that solid right thud that says the ground is no longer hypothetical. Someone across the aisle squeezed someone else's forearm. A kid asked if there would be a cloud. "Maybe," his mom said, "and if there is, we'll ride it." The runway rose to meet us, which is how it is supposed to be when people are in charge and weather isn't making mischief. The last 20 seconds stretched, then snapped back like a rubber band. Touchdown was a firm handshake, not a grab. The reversers made their joyous, purposeful roar, and instead of fear, I felt a rush of gratitude for loud things that behave. We slowed, we turned. A few people clapped, not the touristy clap, but the old kind, the "we are still here" version that you learn in hospitals and church basements. The flight attendant's eyes were shiny when she did the welcome. Mine were too. At the gate, no one rushed. Standing was a communal decision we made slowly, spines negotiating with memories. The aisle filled with that familiar industrial perfume of deplaning. Wool, plastic, a hint of remembered coffee. When it was our turn, the captain stood at the door. Up close, he looked like a man who had spent 2 hours lifting something heavier than a plane. Our fear. "You brought us home," Margaret said, and he shook his head in that way the good ones do. "We did it together." The concourse looked like America going about its business. Departures, reunions, pretzels, oblivious to the fact that we had just held a quiet ceremony at 37,000 feet. I called my sister. "I flew," I said, because that was the whole sentence. My father got the second call. "How was it?" he asked, voice wire straight. "It was possible," I said, and he exhaled so hard it sounded like the end of a storm. Back at the hotel, new city, same lobby choreography, we collected replacement items that felt like borrowed identities. A pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a suitcase that would learn the shape of our lives. A letter from the airline sat in the stack, thick paper with a watermark, promising travel, counseling, support, and quietly, changes. Not the kind you can see on a boarding pass. The kind that live in hangars and manuals and simulators, inspections that look harder, routing that doesn't let all the hope flow through the same artery, training that makes impossible days a little less impossible when they arrive uninvited. I ran my finger along the sentence that said lessons and felt the smallest stitch pull closed. That night, I slept without dreaming that I was still bracing. The next chapters would not be dramatic in the way television prefers. They would be made of appointments and paperwork, of funerals and letters, of anniversaries, and the sound a calendar makes when it turns. There would be hearings in quiet rooms where words like fatigue and uncontained would be said into microphones, with the steadiness those words deserve. There would be reunions with the crew at a memorial where the air would taste like gratitude and grief in equal measure. There would be flights I would take, not because I had to, but because I refused to give a day back to a crack in a disc that didn't know my name. On the desk, I wrote a note I didn't know where to send. Technology failed, people didn't. And then I added the footnote our first flight home had earned. We can learn. We will. I folded the paper and put it in the pocket of the flannel that fit like permission. Tomorrow, we would start the long, less visible work of aftershocks. The ones that arrive in grocery store aisles and at green lights, in the middle of laughter and at the edge of sleep. But tonight, a simple truth got the bed to stop feeling like a raft. We had left and arrived on wings again, not undamaged, not unafraid, just willing. Home was still home, same keys in the same bowl, same plant by the same window, but it sat at a slightly different angle, like a picture frame, after someone walks too hard across the floor. I learned right away that after doesn't arrive like a parade. It leaks in through the seams. A garage door slams 2 houses over and your bones vote to brace. A lawnmower backfires and you're already counting breaths before you can talk yourself back into the kitchen. I kept the hospital wristband on for 3 days, not because I forgot, but because taking it off felt like cooking the last egg in the fridge. Too final. On the 4th day, I slid it over my knuckles and tucked it in a drawer with photos that had lost their captions. In the mirror, I could still see a faint outline where the plastic had been. A friend asked gently if I was going back to work soon. I said yes because I couldn't think of a better sentence. Work had not read the memo about new gravity. Email piles up regardless of what the sky has done to you. I tried to explain to my boss why the coffee grinder sounded like a hydraulic pump and why the elevator lurch made me close my eyes at the 4th floor. He didn't need the details. He handed me a quieter project and a door I could close. The kindness felt like a secret passage. I made appointments the way other people make grocery lists. Primary care for the ache in my neck. A dentist for the molars that had clacked together hard enough to start a rumor. A counselor who explained PTSD like weather. You can't command the storm, but you can step out of the open field. We worked on orientation, a word that meant naming the room. Chair, window, lamp, Wednesday. It sounded childish until it was the only ladder out of a hole. We practiced grounding with a pocket-sized list. 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. I became an expert at cataloging my own kitchen. Some triggers were polite. A smell of hot dust, the thud of a trash truck's hydraulic arm. Others were ambushes. A grocery store speaker popped and my skin went winter cold. An air show poster of a sleek jet had me studying my shoes like there was a test printed on them. I learned to tell the people I loved what I needed in small, clear requests. Stand on my left. Don't startle me from behind. If I stare, give me 10 seconds and not a question. Margaret called on a Sunday to say she'd tried church, and it had sounded like a public address system. She'd left during the first hymn and sat in her car until the steering wheel stopped being a lifeline. We met for lunch at a place with a parking lot where nothing could surprise us. She put her red Bible on the table like a guest, and we ate grilled cheese like kids. She told me she'd joined a support group meeting where no one asked, "What was it like?" because everyone knew the answer was, "It depends on what hour we're talking about." The NTSB called too, polite, patient. There were follow-up questions, clarifications. They asked about timing. I never thought I'd remember. Cart passed twice or 3 times. Smoke from which side first? And I remembered with a clarity that made me suspicious of my own mind. They played back a slice of audio from the CVR. the neutral metronome of checklists and phrases that had kept us in the air longer than physics alone would have. Hearing the calm in those voices felt like borrowing a spine. Weeks later, a packet arrived, a careful letter, resources, and a summary that translated heartbreak into paragraphs. Fan disk fatigue, uncontained failure, hydraulic lines severed, throttle modulation. The words were written in professional ink, but I read them as a psalm. A tiny crack had lived in metal for years, and men in a cockpit, plus a crew in a cabin, had braided human skill into a rope long enough to lower a few hundred souls to where hands could reach us. The recommendations at the end were not headline words. They were hobnails in boots, inspection regimes, routing separation, training emphasis on CRM, emergency use of throttles. It mattered to me that nothing in those pages asked machines to be angels. It asked people to keep being people, on purpose, with better tools. I started to speak in small rooms, a high school auditorium, a Rotary Club breakfast. The back table of a library with a coffee urn and a plate of cookies, everyone politely avoided until someone wasn't polite anymore. I opened with the sentence that had become my internal prologue. Technology failed. People didn't. I told the story clean, not for shock, not for pity, but because telling it put weight on the floorboards and proved they could hold. I talked about the crew and how competence is kindness. I talked about flight attendants whose job description should include stewards of human focus. I talked about strangers making a corridor in a cornfield and how that human geometry saved us as surely as any checklist. Not everyone wanted to hear it. Some wanted the bang and the fire and not the part where we washed someone else's soot out of our hair in a hotel sink. Others wanted a tidy arc that ended at closure like a door clicks shut. Life doesn't oblige tidy arcs. I learned to say, "This is where I stop," and change the subject to casseroles. On the first anniversary, July 19th, the town gathered us again like a family who never quite stopped setting extra plates. We flew in, yes, flew, on tickets the airline had offered, with a note that read like a vow. The approach over Iowa made my palms say their piece. The runway looked like any other runway, which was part of the holiness of runways. They are built to ignore drama. At the memorial, names on a stone arranged the day into something you could touch. We said each out loud. The crew's names had become a shorthand on our tongues for a particular kind of courage that does not ask to be called that. I met first responders again, without the mask of adrenaline. They were shorter or taller than memory, younger and older at the same time, the way people get when you put a year on them. We stood across from each other with paper plates and plastic forks and said the things you say when language can't bring back a minute. "How are you sleeping?" "Better." "You?" "Sometimes." A firefighter admitted she still woke at the smell of a barbecue if the wind took it exactly wrong. A nurse said she'd bought new shoes because the ones she'd worn in the field held a day in their treads she couldn't track into her home. Someone asked me if I was forgiving the metal. The question was fine-grained enough to deserve a better answer than I had. I said I didn't think forgiveness was the right shape for an element. Titanium doesn't apologize. But I was satisfied. Yes, that's the word. That we had listened to what failed and learned a different way to route, to train, to look for cracks where pride had assumed smoothness. Satisfied is a modest word. It fit. Margaret started sending me postcards from everywhere she dared go again. Lay X, she printed once, lettered big like a dare, and below it, sat by the exit, aisle. Eric mailed me a photo of his framed CT scan captioned, "Operating under warranty." Humor kept sneaking past the guards and doing the tender work grimness never can. We formed a group text we never muted, a lifeline of mundane, sunlight on a kitchen table, birthday cakes that leaned, a dog asleep upside down with all four paws in the air. It's impossible to overstate how curative it is to be bored together again. Flying became a practice, not a betrayal. I learned new rituals, aisle seats, pre-boards when offered, a quiet word to a flight attendant who would nod like a colleague and ask, "Forward or aft?" Sometimes I'd press my fingers lightly to the seam of the window shade, not to look out, but to prove to my muscles that light could change without danger hitching a ride. On bumpy days, I'd watch the cabin crew with the reverence you reserve for ballet and firefighters. If they were calm, I let their calm take the wheel. If a fellow passenger got loud with fear, I'd say, "Watch the flight attendants. They know what normal looks like." It helped us both. There were hearings I watched on C-SPAN that looked like sleep aids until your life had threads in them. Engineers testified in careful verbs. Manufacturers agreed to inspections that would live inside hangars where janitors know the names of planes like pets. Unions argued for training that made crews braver about being human with each other. CRM turned from an acronym to a muscle everyone flexed. It was a relief to see bureaucratic sentences bend towards sentences that would keep someone else's row number from being a headline. Grief didn't file an itinerary. It arrived in ambush anniversaries, the smell of jet fuel on a cold morning, a headline about maintenance, a calendar date punched out of the month like a missing tooth. At funerals I could attend, I sat and learned people through the people who loved them. Mike, who carved duck decoys. Elena, who wore a crooked ponytail and sang badly in keys that made everyone else sing along. Mr. Tran, who taught his grandson to thread a needle and fix torn seams. The specifics mattered. Statistics never held my hand in a field. People did. By the second anniversary, I started to say yes when the airline asked if I'd speak to new hire classes of flight attendants. I told them what it sounds like when a cabin turns into a choir. How their brace commands braided our spines together, how the no-bags rule is not about luggage, but about seconds, how the authority in their voices becomes the furniture we cling to when the room moves. I watched their faces do the complicated math of pride and dread and vocation. At the end, someone always asked, "What should we not say?" And I told them the truth. Don't invent guarantees. Promise the next verb instead. There were days I failed the after test. I froze on a jet bridge once and walked back out, body marching the other way with the stubbornness of a mule. I cried next to the printers at work because a PDF showed a black and white aerial photo of a field that could have been ours if the topography had gotten lazy. I apologized more than I needed to. Then I stopped apologizing for the wrong things and started apologizing for the late ones, texts unreturned, dishes unwashed, like a citizen again. When the final report went public, I read it in one sitting, pen in hand like a student. I underlined a line about fracture mechanics I didn't entirely grasp and drew a heart next to phrases about crew coordination I understood in my bones. The report didn't call anyone a hero. Neither did it pretend that what happened to us was an unavoidable act of weather. It said, in its dry, faithful way, that systems can be taught to fail better, that redundancy must mean separation, and that training can drag miracles a few inches closer to the plausible. It was the plainest, most beautiful kind of literature I'd ever read, the kind that translates loss into rules someone else will live by. I keep one relic in the bowl by the door with my keys, the ring with the nick torn into it by the airplane's jagged mouth. Some mornings I wear it and forget it's there until a banister catches it and the nick says ping against wood. Most mornings it stays in the bowl and I touch it on my way out like a mezuzah. Remember, not the fire, not the spin, the corridor of hands, the counting of names, the voices calling brace, not as prophecy, but as instruction you can obey and live. I don't romanticize survival. It is not a moral achievement, it is a location. What you do with it, that might be character. Here is what I try to do. When alarms go off, I move toward them if moving helps. When someone asks for a story, I give the useful version. When I sit by a stranger on a plane, I notice them. I offer the window if they need to check where the light is. I count the rows to the exit anyway. I listen to the safety briefing like it's new because it is. This crew has never done this flight with these people. Technology failed. People didn't. If I have a religion now, it is maintenance of machines, of skills, of each other. We grease the hinges and learn to say, I need help, without shame. We learn to route the important lines where one stray shard can't find them. We inspect what fatigue keeps trying to hide. We build redundancies not just in metal, but in care. And when, not if, the sky asks for more from us than we thought we had, we make a little nation again, fast and temporary and real, and we carry each other the last hard inches to ground. Some endings arrive like door slams. Ours took the shape of a long hallway with lights that flicked on one by one. Memorials, hearings, reunions, first flights back, first nights slept through. The first time the word normal didn't sound like a dare. A year became 2, then 5. I learned that survival is not a medal you wear, but a muscle you work quietly on Tuesdays. I kept flying, not because courage made a home in me, but because fear did. And I refused to let it pick the furniture. Rituals helped. I chose aisle seats and counted rows to exits while the boarding music played. I watched flight attendants like they were lead climbers on a route my life was tied to. I touched the nick in my ring before takeoff, a small, private handshake with the part of me that knew the sky could be both beautiful and indifferent. The story kept asking for me in rooms I never expected to stand in. One afternoon, I found myself at a training center, the kind with windowless hallways and posters that make checklists look heroic. A simulator bay hummed with the soft menace of very expensive realism. An instructor with a whiteboard smile asked if I'd mind talking to a new hire class about the cabin. I told them what it felt like when the airplane's body language changed from cruise to fight, and how their voices, their brace cadence, their insistence on no bags, shoes on, had made a corridor out of chaos. Don't be humble about your authority, I said. It's not ego, it's architecture. I watched them nod and write and meet each other's eyes, and I recognized the look. People ready to be useful on the worst day of someone else's life. Later, a captain with the kind of hands that look permanently inked with grease told me the United 232 scenario lived in simulators now, throttle work, CRM, the choreography you rehearse so that on the day a machine stops listening, people do not. He didn't say it like a boast. He said it like a promise, delivered late, but delivered. I said thank you, as if he had fixed a hinge in my house that had always squeaked. Anniversaries arrived like soft-voiced inspectors. Some years I flew to Sioux City for the memorial and stood with faces I now knew better than cousins. We read names aloud under a sky that sometimes pretended to be ordinary out of kindness. I hugged firefighters who still smelled faintly of motor oil even in dress uniforms. We told the holy jokes, the small wry ones you earn by not leaving each other. A new first responder would show up with the awkward gravity of someone walking into a room mid-prayer, and we would make space, scooting down the pew of memory to let them sit. There were quieter anniversaries too. In kitchens and offices and parking lots, grief tapped my shoulder with long fingers. A dumpster lid slammed and my stomach free-climbed a cliff. A pressure cooker hissed like escaping hydraulics, and I was in 2 places at once. The counselor's voice I'd borrowed early on still had a room in my head. Name 5 things you see. Ground your feet. Decide what you can do next and do that. In the grocery line, I'd put both palms on the handle of my cart and count the gum packs, the tabloids, the lottery tickets, until the room came back into focus and time resumed its cooperative shape. I visited schools and told the story to kids who had not been born in 1989. I brought a crew lanyard a flight attendant had given me, a safety card, a foam earplug from some mercifully boring flight. Show and tell for resilience. Machines fail, I said plainly. Humans can learn. I talked about redundancy and why it doesn't count if you run all your backups through the same vulnerable hallway. I talked about inspection that respects both the microscope and the calendar, how tiny cracks live boring lives for years before becoming headlines. I kept the metaphors tight because kids know when you're trying to buy time with pretty words. Once, in a Q&A, a boy in a hoodie put his hand up and said, "So, are you scared all the time, or just sometimes?" I told him the truth. I'm scared sometimes. But fear is information, not a verdict. He nodded like I'd just adjusted a seatbelt for him. There were reunions that felt like pulling into a familiar driveway. At one, I met a flight attendant who had trained with our auburn-haired attendant years later and learned her cadence by heart from people who owed their lives to it. "We practice to make our voices fit in your ears when you need them," she said. I wanted to write that sentence on the inside of every airplane door. The final report never made my pulse race. It made something steadier in me hum. Fatigue crack, uncontained failure, hydraulic lines severed in common area. Crew resource management contributed to survivability. Dry words, holy function. I underlined a recommendation about titanium inspection so many times the page looked tattooed. It mattered that the paperwork didn't settle for weather metaphors or fate. It mattered that somewhere a design would be redrawn. A routing would take 2 different paths through an airplane's skeleton. A manual would change a comma to a period and save 3 lives in 2031. There were funerals too, some soon, some decades later, where I sat in pews and learned the biographies that begin in kitchens, not cockpits. At one, a son told a story about his father's insistence on turning off the lights when leaving a room, and how that habit had grown into a map of care that reached as far as a flight deck. At another, a colleague described a captain whose favorite word was "we," and how every sentence in the cockpit was built like a bridge with more than one beam. We cried without embarrassment and then ate ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper in the church hall because grief requires protein and chairs. Life went on in its messy precision. Margaret sent me postcards from places she had dared, ATL, SFO, BOS, and began to collect airport codes the way some people collect churches or stadiums. She started to ask flight attendants to teach her the brace in every airplane type, as if she were learning dialects. "It's all the same language," she'd text, "just different accents." Eric switched sales jobs, kept the framed CT scan on his office wall where only the brave asked about it, and became the guy who knew how to talk anxious flyers down without making them feel small. We stayed a little nation, small but sovereign. The ring with the nick lived in the bowl by my door. Some mornings I wore it and forgot it until it snagged a sweater, and the small metal shout reminded me to be where my shoes were. Other mornings I left it, touching it for luck on my way out, like a peculiar door chime. It turned out you can carry an airplane in the shape of a ding and not feel haunted, only instructed. People asked, less and less often, the question that used to have its own gravity: why do you still fly? I told them flying was the cleanest expression I knew of a complicated truth. Trust is a decision you make more than once. We choose pilots and crews and mechanics with our tickets. We choose each other with our attention. I don't worship airplanes. I respect them. What I worship, if that's the word, is maintenance. Of machines, yes, but also of vows and checklists and neighborliness. The grease, the drills, the conversations, the no you say to convenience because separation of systems is non-negotiable. The yes you say to the next person who needs a hand through a torn opening into a field. On a porch one July night a dozen years later, thunder walked over the horizon like a thoughtful giant. I sat with my father, now slower, still sharp, and he asked in that casual way he uses when the question is bigger than the sentence, "You ever think about that day?" I said, "Every day. But it's not all fire." I told him about the corridor people made in corn, about the way a town held strangers long enough for them to stand up again, about names learned and said out loud, about the way training rooms got louder after we were quiet. He nodded and patted the rail like he was checking its bolts. "Machines don't love you," he said, repeating himself kindly. "But people can." On the 30th anniversary, we stood again in Iowa. Families, crew, responders. Kids born into a story they'd only ever seen in photos. The speeches were short. The wind was honest. A bell rang the names one by one, and between each there was a space wide enough to walk a life through. When it was over, a little girl tugged my sleeve and asked if airplanes were still safe. I crouched to her level and told her the safest true thing I knew. Safer today, because people paid attention yesterday. I don't know if the sky keeps score. I do know that when technology failed us once, people refused to. They refused loudly, with engines and hoses and radios and shouts. They refused quietly, with clipboards and casseroles, and the courage to sit next to someone who needed sitting next to. They keep refusing in maintenance hangars at 2 a.m., in classrooms where CRM drills sound like poetry to the right ears, in homes where survivors count the rows to exits and then count blessings without apology. The long arc doesn't bend by itself. We lay hands on it. Pilots, attendants, mechanics, controllers, nurses, farmers, kids with braces holding doors, and we push. The arc complains. It moves a fraction. Sometimes that's enough to change a Thursday in July from a headline into a flight that lands, a child who sleeps, a story that ends with "we arrived." Technology failed. People didn't. That's the sentence I write at the top of every page. On good days, I add the footnote that keeps me willing to board. People learned, and they keep learning.